Brutal, inhumane and ruthless, the Drukhari revel in piracy, enslavement and torture and are sadistic to the extreme. In today's video, I'll show you my take on how to build and paint a grimdark, horrific and sinister Drukhari Archon. I'm Black Chalice Studio and you are watching the Grimdark Compendium. The first step in helping to achieve my vision of a truly sinister Archon was to alter the original pose of the miniature. I wasn't really a fan of the crossed arms look when built straight from the box, so decided to open up its silhouette, providing a more menacing and free-flowing look. Here at the Grimdark Compendium, we actively encourage kit bashing, converting and scratch building to not only make your miniatures individual, but also to push them in the direction you see in your mind's eye. On the Archon, I swapped out both of the arms and the head, created a tattered shawl from some cheesecloth, scratch built some torture tools from varying gauges of wire, and added some fine chain to bring it all together. All of these additions were modelled in a way as to match the flow of the miniature. For example, the shawl was manipulated to match the direction that the cape is flowing in the wind. Even something as simple as changing the angle of the head can give a totally different look. Here I tilted the head slightly back into the side, to change the bland, staring straight ahead look to a more menacing, even mocking gaze towards his next victim. To begin with, looking at the flesh cape on his back, it's completely flat and devoid of any texture, so to remedy this we're going to use a surface manipulation technique. To do this we apply a layer of extra thin plastic cement to one part of the cape at a time, and while it's still wet we come in with an old frayed brush and gently tap, dab and pull at the surface. This will produce microscopic marks, dents and bumps, which gives the ideal texture for flayed skin. We just slowly work our way around the cape here, adding texture to one piece at a time. These are the kinds of results you can achieve with this method. Moving on to the first texture pass, we're going to use AK Interactive Muddy Ground. I'll apply it directly from the pot and then quickly wipe off my brush and feather away any hard edges. For our second texture pass, it's AK Interactive Corrosion Texture Paste. We concentrate this on the metallic parts of the miniature, such as the hooks, the chains, and on the pistol. I'll go back for a second pass here on certain areas, just to reinforce that texture a bit more. The final pre-weathering stage here today is going to be some physical distressing. For this, we come in with a sharp scalpel blade and work our way around the miniature, adding small chips, cuts, and areas of battle damage. It's easy to go overboard with this step, so just work your way around the miniature slowly, adding a little bit here and there. For priming the miniature, we're going to use Stynel Res Black, applied in 2 to 3 thin coats through the airbrush at around 25 psi. With the primer applied, I'll give the miniature around 10 to 15 minutes to dry. As a base coat for the cape, we're going to come in with GW Kislev Flesh. This is also applied in a few thin coats in a zenithal manner through the airbrush, just build this up gradually. I also use Kislev Flesh to base coat the small amount of skin on the back of the head. I've left this separate for now, just for ease of access. Moving on to the highlight colour for the skin and the flesh, we're going to use GW Deepkin Flesh. For this application, I'll deliberately turn the PSI on my compressor down to around 15. This will produce a spattering effect which gives a really nice mottled finish. Once again, this is applied in a zenithal manner, building up a few transparent coats. To add some shading and colour variation to the cape, we're going to come in with GW Reichland Flesh Shade. This is built up over 2 to 3 thin, very transparent layers. The key here is to keep this nice and subtle, just smooth colour gradients and a little bit of shading. For the armour, I wanted to give the impression of a strange and exotic alien metal. So to begin with, I use Vallejo Metal Colour Magnesium. I thin this roughly 2 parts water to 1 part paint and apply it in a stippling manner, working my way around the miniature slowly over a couple of thin coats, avoiding the recesses. For the first armour highlight, I mix in an equal amount of Scale 75 Thrash Metal. Applied in the same manner as the base coat, we concentrate this more towards the upper edges and places where the light would naturally catch. For the second armour highlight, I take 2 parts of the previous mix and add 1 part Vallejo Silver. Once again stippling this mixture on, we concentrate more and more towards the points where light would reflect. For the final highlight pass on the armour, I add a touch more silver to the previous mix. This is used very sparingly, just on the extreme high edges and points of reflection. The base coat for the bronze parts of the miniature is Dark Star Blackened Bronze. This is applied in a stippling manner once again, slowly building up the opacity and adding a small amount of texture as we go. For the first highlight pass on the bronze, the mix is 1:1 blackened bronze to Vallejo metal colour gold. And for the final highlight, I add a small amount of Vallejo silver. Once again, this is just applied to the very top edges and areas that light would catch. For the blade on this miniature, I wanted to convey the look of some strange kind of alien bone material. For the base coat, I came in with GW Rhinox hide, applied in a stippling manner over a few thin coats. The next step was 1:1 Rhinox hide to iron rack skin. With this application, I also started to introduce some downward motions with the brush, starting at the back of the blade and working towards the edge. Following on from the previous step, I now went back in with pure iron rack skin. Whilst this was also stippled on to a degree, I focused more and more on that downward motion from the back of the blade towards the edge. And for the final highlight on the blade, it's a 1:1 mix of iron rack skin and Pro Acryl bold titanium white. For this final highlight, I don't go in with stippling, I just continue with the downward strokes with the brush. And this is how the miniature's looking so far. This clip here briefly shows how I go about using and mixing Villainy ink. Rather than using a traditional well palette, I like to use artist grade palette paper. After giving the Villainy ink bottles a good shake on a vortex mixer, I decant the inks directly onto this paper. Mixing them this way gives a far greater degree of control. With this in mind, we move on to the unifying wash for the armour and the details. For this, I use a 2:1 mix of Villainy ink, Goon's Grime and Ichor of the Damned. This mix is thinned 1:1 with mineral spirits and applied as a fairly liberal wash, just try not to let it pool in all the recesses too much. I'll come back with a second application as well, just to reinforce that grime in certain areas. I'll then take a 1:1 mix of Ichor of the Damned and Goon's Grime and apply this as a shading wash. This is applied to certain areas like around the chain, the tools and the top of the shawl, just to provide additional shading and darken out the crevices. Using a blow dryer on medium heat, I'll flash off the spirits in this unifying wash for around 15 to 20 seconds. For the removal pass here, I'll begin with a Q-tip for the broader, more accessible parts of the miniature, such as the chest armour. I use soft, repeated tapping and dabbing motions which will reactivate the wash and gently begin to remove it away from the raised edges. I'll then switch over to a brush and spirits for any hard to reach areas. To remove the unifying wash from the shawl on his back, I use almost like a dry brushing technique, just soft and gentle downward strokes with the brush. I'll just work my way around the miniature slowly. I'll do one overall pass and then go back in for a second, more focused pass on areas that I want a less pronounced unifying wash effect. This steps down to personal preference. You can leave lots of grime on there or remove more for a cleaner finish. Moving on to the unifying wash for the bone blade and the skulls, I'll come in with neat Goon's Grime. When Goon's Grime is undiluted, it will give a much stronger and more pronounced effect. This will be ideal for giving across the impression of ancient, crusty and pitted bone. I want the grime effect more pronounced on the blade and the skulls, so for the removal pass, I lightly dampen the Q-tip with spirits and don't take too much of the wash away. I'll begin by tapping and dabbing with the damp end of the Q-tip just to reactivate the enamel wash, and then switch to the dry side to clean up the excess. Now we're going to move on to bringing some life, or perhaps more aptly, death, into his cape. To begin with, we'll start with the unifying wash of Villainy ink Dystopian Brown, diluted 1:1 with mineral spirits. This is applied as a fairly generous unifying wash, and once I've got it on there, I'll go back and wick up any excess so it doesn't pool in the crevices. I'll come in with a second, more focused pass afterwards, just concentrating on the stitched areas. While the Dystopian Brown unifying wash is still wet, I'll come in with some neat Goon's Grime and apply it like a spot wash. I'll stipple this on to certain areas of the cape, just to alter the colour hue and add a bit more shading. This will blend effortlessly with the Dystopian Brown unifying wash, creating some visual interest and adding a real nasty, diseased look to certain areas of the cape. After a quick blow dry, I'll come in with a Q-tip fairly heavily loaded with spirits and begin the removal pass. I'll focus this mainly on the centre of the panels of flesh, reactivating the wash and taking it away from the broader areas, leaving it in the recesses and around the stitches. Switching over to a brush and spirits, I'll come back in and just clean off any excess wash from the centre of the flesh panels, creating a smooth transition. To add some visual interest and colour diversity to the shawl, I'll come in with a filtering pass of Neat Goon's Grime. This is applied in a kind of stippling manner to the deeper folds and anywhere I want to introduce a darker, more brown grimy colour. Now we're moving on to the real fun parts of painting this miniature. To begin with, we'll start with a rust pass. You may notice that I'm using Villainy ink Ex Machina here. This is the colour that we all know and love as Sector Rust. The Sector Rust you have now will henceforth be known as Ex Machina, and when the second wave of Villainy ink enamels hit, Sector Rust will be a new, darker rust tone. With that in mind, we take a 1-to-1 mix of Ex Machina and Ichor of the Damned and apply this as a spot wash to the metals. For our second rust pass, we're going to come in with straight Ex Machina. With this mix, I cover less area than the previous step, just to imply a brighter, more fresh rust. After giving the rust pass a quick blast with a hairdryer on medium heat, we'll move on to the removal. I'll go fairly light with the removal pass here, alternating between a Q-tip and a brush and just taking the wash away from the raised edges, leaving it in the crevices. The previous rust steps are also applied to the black gun casing, and after the removal pass this will leave a really nice reddish orange tint. Moving on to the final rust steps here, we're going to come in with Dirty Down Rust. This is diluted 1-to-1 with water and applied mainly to the crevices and areas that we want really heavily corroded and built up crusty rust. The last step here is to come in with Neat Dirty Down Rust. This neat application will give the most texture and the darkest colour for our rust. I apply this quite sparingly to certain parts of the armour, but reserve it mainly for the chains, the hooks and any areas that I want the heaviest and most dirty, old, crusty corrosion. This step is also down to personal preference. You can go as heavy or as light as you like. And here's how the miniature's looking so far. Now we're going to come back in and just punch up the contrast on the parts where we added the rust in the previous step. For this, I'm going to come in with Vallejo Silver, diluted roughly 2 parts water to 1 part paint. For the chains and the hooks, I'm going to come in with a kind of dry brushing motion from the top down just to pick out the raised edges. And moving on to the armour plates, I'm just going to glaze it on to the high points just to bring back a little bit of shine. In this clip, you can see how I go about mixing up my initial gore application. I'll lay out some Carrion Crimson and Ichor of the Damned on my palette paper so I can mix these two on the fly. I'll take a small amount of Ichor of the Damned and add it to my Carrion Crimson to create a darker, more blackish red. For the first application, I'll come in with Carrion Crimson, diluted 1-to-1 with spirits. This is applied as a crevice wash to the areas where the parts of the cape meet and around the stitching. I'll also let this pool up slightly, not too much, just a little bit. Once the first pass is down, I'll go back in with the second application just to increase the saturation and intensity of the colour. Now we're going to come back in with some Neat Carrion Crimson. I apply this in a stippling manner to the areas around where the stitching is. I'll also carry the stippling on out towards the centre of the flesh panels just a little bit. This will reinforce the look of inflamed and torn flesh that we're going for. Now we're going to come in with that darker bloody mix and apply this as a crevice wash just between the stitches and the areas where the parts of the capes meet. We're going to come back in with a blow dryer once again for around 10 to 15 seconds on a medium heat setting just to flash off the spirits and the bloody bits that we applied in the last step. As we move on to the removal and feathering pass for the blood effects on the cape, we're going to employ a couple of different techniques here. To start with, I'm going to come in with a Q-tip, lightly dampen with spirits and reactivate the wash from the centre of the flesh panels on the cape. With this step, I'm just looking to clean off the centre of the panels and reactivate the wash slightly so it's easier to blend in. I'll gradually work my way from the centre of the panels towards the areas where the stitching and the tears are. I'll then swap over to a brush lightly dampened with spirits and begin a little bit closer to where the stitching is, working out towards the centre of the panels. By doing it this way, we can spread out some of the pigment in Carrion Crimson to create a really nice mottled look and also add some surface finish variation. To add some more visual interest, we're going to add some verdigris to the bronze. To do this, I'll take a 3:1 mix of Abdalung 502 turquoise lights and smoke, thin 3:1 with spirits and applied as a spot wash. Coming in with neat turquoise lights, diluted 3:1 with spirits again, we're going to apply this to certain areas of the previous step just for a lighter tone. For the removal pass here, I'll come in with a Q-tip and a brush with some spirits and take off most of the turquoise wash we applied in the last step, just leaving it in the crevices. Now we're getting to the stage where we can really push that bloody, gory and sinister look. To start with, I'll take some neat carrying crimson and apply it in a stippling manner to the blade. I concentrate on the edge and work slowly backwards towards the back of the blade. For each successive coat of carrying crimson that I apply, I'll concentrate more and more towards the edge of the blade. I'm also going to apply some downward strokes with the brush here alongside the stippling, just to add small lines that give the impression of blood splatter. With each successive coat that we apply, we're also building up a nice chunky texture. For the final step here on the blade, I'll come in with a 2:1 mix of carrying crimson and Ichor of the Damned and stipple this just onto the blade edge, giving us a wonderful, old, coagulated blood style effect. Coming back in here with a brush, lightly dampened with spirits, I'm just going to feather away at the transition at the back of the blade, removing the blood and revealing the bone colour underneath. As you can see here, I also applied the previous gore steps to the torture tools on his back and the hooks at the end of the chains. I applied the gore fairly heavily to the tools and the hooks, and I chose not to come back for a removal pass here, just so the effect was more pronounced. To add another layer of visual interest and some surface finish variation here, I came in with some blood splatter. I loaded some carrying crimson up onto an old frayed brush and used my airbrush needle to flick the bristles towards a miniature, creating a random spatter pattern. For the final gore step on the sword, the hooks and the torture tools, we're going to come in with green stuff oiled coagulated blood. My first application of this was thinned 1:1 with water and applied in a dabbing and stippling manner just along the edge of the blade and the tips of the tools. The final application is applied neat from the bottle. This is used very sparingly, just in certain places that you want a really thick, chunky texture. This dries with an extremely glossy finish, which helps sell the effect of freshly spilled blood. Just to punch up the contrast on the skulls a little bit more here, I come in with some Ichor of the Damned, thinned 1:1 with spirits, and apply it to the wraps holding the skulls in place. Once applied, I'll come in with a brush and some spirits and feather away the excess. For the highlights on the red, I'm going to come back in with GW Mephiston Red. I'll thin this 2 parts water to 1 part paint and apply this as a glaze on the areas on the gun and more like a dry brush kind of motion on the wraps of the torture tools on his back. I'll build this up over 2 to 3 thin layers, just increasing the intensity and saturation a little bit each time. You could always add a touch of orange to this mix here just to brighten things up a little bit, but I wanted a quite dull, muted and old looking red. Coming in for some highlights on the bronze here, I used a 2:1 mix of Vallejo Metal Colour Gold and Vallejo Silver. With a fairly diluted paint and a lightly loaded brush, I just applied small dots and lines to simulate wear and tear and scratches along leading edges. At this point I decided that the shawl on his back needed a slight variation of colour once again. For this I took a 3:1 mix of Goon's Grime and Ichor of the Damned and applied it to the shawl in a stippling manner in random patches, just to add some colour variation. I built this up over 2 to 3 passes just to build up the intensity. Coming back in with a brush slightly dampened with spirits, I feathered and stippled at the edges of the places I'd applied the previous wash, just to create smooth gradients and transitions. Moving on to the final effects for this miniature, we're going to apply some decay to the shawl. Using Villainy Ink Decay of Death straight from the bottle, we apply this in random patches in a stippling manner. After the first application, I'll go in for another pass just to reinforce the effect even more. Decay of Death dries to an extremely chalky, whitish green, almost grey finish that gives a wonderful, decrepit, filthy look. You can see the effect start to take hold as soon as we hit it with a blow dryer, again on medium heat for around 10 to 15 seconds. To really punch up the level of surface finish variation we have on this miniature, and to add some extra realism, we're going to come in with an ultra matte varnish. This is applied over a couple of layers to the wraps on the torture tools on his back. This was also applied to the skulls and the racks holding them to his trophy rack. When this dries, it will give off a really nice dusty and old effect. And as a last step here, we're going to come in with some satin varnish and hit the gems on the casing of his weapon. These variations in finish, along with the textures we have, give an incredibly realistic look. For the final step here, and just to add some age to those skulls on his trophy rack, we're going to come in with an application of Decay of Death. This is applied neat from the bottle, and I'll concentrate more towards the crevices and bottom of the skulls. I'll also build this application up over 2 to 3 layers just to reinforce it even further. Even though the base on this miniature is tiny, it still deserves some attention. It was prime black along with the rest of the miniature, and while I was base coating the cape on the back, I let the colour flow over the base to create a nice gradient. I'll then come in with a quick dry brush of iron rack skin just on the skull and the bones. I'll follow this up with a very light dry brush with Pro Acryl Bold Titanium White, just catching the raised edges of the bones and the skull. For our unifying wash on the base, I take Goon's Grime, thin it down 1 to 1 with mineral spirits, and apply as a very liberal wash across the entirety of the base, including the skull and the bones. While the unifying wash is still wet, I'll come in with some neat Goon's Grime and stipple this on in patches just to add some shading into the crevices and around the details. As before, I'll go fairly heavy with this, not really concerned about it pooling up anywhere. I'll then swap out to the blow dryer on medium heat once again for around 30 seconds or so. We just want to keep going at it until it looks dry to the touch. Because we applied a fairly heavy wash, you'll notice that when it's dry it gives a stronger and much more pronounced effect. For the removal pass here, I'll just come with a Q-tip and some spirits, and I'm only really concentrating on the edge of the rocks, the raised areas and the skull and the bones, leaving a nice dusty and crusty look on the rest of the base. Our next step is going to be application of neat Decay of Death. I gradually stippled on 3 to 4 layers of this here, building it up around the base of the rocks, in the dirt, around his feet a little bit, and on the skull and the ribcage on the base. After this, I blow dried it again for around 30 seconds on a medium heat. Moving on to the home straight, we have our first dry pigment application. For this, I use Russian Earth from MIG, applied with an old brush in a stippling motion towards the base of the rocks, around his feet a little bit just to tie him into the base, and also the skull and the bones. I added a second layer of this pigment around the bottom of the rocks and the deepest crevices, just to increase the dusty effect. For our second and final pigment pass, I came in with Abtalung 502 Ashes Grey. This was applied in the same manner as the previous pigment step. I concentrated a little bit more towards the rocks here, also catching the bottom of his feet and his greaves to tie everything together nicely. These steps will provide you with a nice, simple yet effective Grimdark rubble basing scheme. And here we have the end result, a grimdark, sinister and barbaric Drukhari Archon. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the video. For many more like it, including an in-depth look at all of the techniques discussed today, check out the Grimdark Compendium. If you head on over there now, you can check out some exciting information on the return of our Grimdark Challenge, where you'll have the opportunity to show us your skills and win some absolutely fantastic prizes. Keep your eyes peeled for more information. I bid you a good week, keep it grim, and I will see you next time.